I grew up as probably the last generation where being a strong masculine man was rewarded. Women expected it of you, they appreciated it of you, they rewarded you for it, right? And so did society at large.
Nick Freitas is the author of The Man Book, a point-by-point guide to sucking it up and getting the job done.
They want a noble mission. They want to do difficult things, they want to do hard things, but they've been told that they need to be emasculated because they're what's wrong with society. That is incredibly confusing to young men.
A former Green Beret and Virginia state legislator, Freitas joins me to share a much-needed message for today's young men.
What we need is to understand that God has created men for a particular purpose. We're supposed to be strong, we're supposed to be capable. Why? So we can honor God, protect our families, and protect our civilization.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick.
Nick Freitas, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So you just said something very interesting. This conference we're at here today, ARC, it's all about saving or restoring Western civilization. But you're saying that when young men hear about this, they're not thinking about it the same way that many of the people here are. Tell me more.
So essentially, when most of us say Western civilization, especially in an area like this, we all kind of look at this as a combination of classically liberal values with respect to free markets, private property rights, representative government. We think about things like John Locke or Montesquieu, Blackstone, the founding fathers of the United States. These are the things that are automatically conjured up when we talk about Western civilization, and therefore it's obvious to all of us and why it should be saved. But if you're a young man that has gone through about the last 20 years where you've watched as most of pop culture has told you that you are responsible for all of the world's ills, that the future is female, that you really don't have a place, that your masculinity is toxic, and therefore the solution is to make you more feminine. Well, if you're a young man hearing about, well, we got to save civilization, a young man's obvious and quite frankly logical response to that is, do you mean the civilization that hates me or the civilization that was too weak to protect me from the popular culture that hates me? Because either way, that's not an enticement. And so if you want to know why a lot of young men are starting to entertain ideas, philosophies, and ideologies that I think a lot of us were thought left dead and buried in the 20th century, that's why. The other reason why they're starting to entertain what we might consider some of the worst philosophies is because for 20 years they've been told by what we might call critical theorists, or in America what we refer to as woke, or feminists, that they're Nazis, right? That they're fascists. So imagine you're a young man and you don't really have as much of a frame of reference for these things other than you know that they're bad. And now you're being called these things by people who clearly hate you. You've never identified of those things. You don't even know what those things really are on any sort of like base philosophical level. But you know what you do know? You know all of your enemies hate that thing. Well, if all of your enemies hate that thing and they hate you, maybe it's time to reconsider that thing. And so the very people that claim to want to stop fascism and Nazism and bigotry and everything else are the ones actually allowing for those things to be reconsidered within popular conversation among young men because they've been inappropriately identified as those things. And so I think it's critical now more than ever that if we're going to talk about saving Western civilization, then we better do a much better job of identifying it. And we better have the men within that civilization doing a much better job stepping up and defending the young men that have been repeatedly attacked by certain sectors of the popular culture.
But, per your book, Man Book, the young men need to suck it up as well, right? As you're talking about this, part of me is thinking of it as a kind of a victimology in itself.
Well, so actually that's a good point. So I'm not calling for anybody to be a victim, but we've created within pop culture and within the left, victim status and intersectional politics is how you gain social currency. So the more victim things I can claim, the more powerful I am. And we shouldn't be surprised because if you look at Karl Marx, right, it's from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Well, that sort of philosophy prioritizes need over ability. Ability is put upon, it's punished. Need is rewarded with more stuff. Right, so we shouldn't be surprised when Marxist ideologies yield to the sort of society that says, I want to accumulate as many victim points as I can get. I'm not telling young men to adopt a victim mentality. What I'm doing is I'm acknowledging that they're actually facing an onslaught that arguably men throughout time have never faced before. I grew up in the 90s, right? I went off and I fought for my country. I was in Army Special Forces. Masculinity.
Tell me a little more about that, actually. Yeah.
So, I graduated high school in 1998. I got married in 1999. I joined the military in 98. I served in Army Special Forces, better known as Green Berets. So I did a couple combat tours over in Iraq, doing a lot of kicking indoors and finding bad guys. And I grew up as probably the last generation where being a strong masculine man was rewarded. Women expected it of you. They appreciated it of you. They rewarded you for it, right? And so did society at large, right? We respected men who put on a badge, put on a uniform, did dangerous things. We respected successful business leaders. Well, that started to change fairly quickly. It had already been changing within our university system, but it hadn't actually filtered down into popular culture until, I would argue, after I was graduated high school, married, had a profession. And so I think it's important for men of my generation to understand that we face challenges, right? Yeah, at 25, I was at war. A lot of 25-year-olds now, we're not at war at 25, right? My grandfather was fighting the Empire of Japan during World War II at 16, right? And didn't expect to be thanked for it. It was just something that you did. Those are incredible challenges, right? They're challenges that could potentially cost you your life, but they were also challenges that you were rewarded, appreciated, and respected for. Now I want you to imagine an environment where, economically, in many respects, technologically wise, there's more creature comforts than we could ever imagine. And so it's easier for men of my generation to look at younger men and be like, what are you complaining about? You have access to all of this freedom, safety, opportunity. What are you complaining about? And the thing is that what they're complaining about is they want a noble mission. They want to do difficult things. They want to do hard things, but they've been told that they need to be emasculated because they're what's wrong with society. That is incredibly confusing to young men. So I'm not telling them to be victims. Mm-hmm. As you said, the subtitle of my book is How to Suck It Up and Get the Job Done, because that's what defines a man. What defines a man, other than the biological traits, right? What defines a man is your ability to put aside a desire for comfort or a desire to avoid danger in order to fulfill your word, to protect the people that you love, and to protect the things that you love. And so, yes, even this generation of men will have to suck it up and be a man and get the job done. But we're not going to convince them of that if we don't first acknowledge that for the last 20 years, they've largely been told to sit down, shut up, and that they have no place. So acknowledge the problem. I'm not going to reward them. Now, if they choose to be victims as a result of this, if they choose to say, well, I don't care, I'm going to give up on civilization, I'm just going to play video games and watch porn, well, then I'm going to tell them they've adopted a victim mentality and they're weak, because that's accurate. What I'm telling them to do is that, no, we need them. We need them to actually stand up, and if they don't like what's going on in society, they need to be a part of the solution for that.
Well, and what I hear you saying is that we need to communicate aggressively to them that we need them for that.
We need to do a couple of things. We need to communicate it aggressively. We need to stick up for them when the culture is trying to push them down, right? Men my age need to say, back off, that he's doing the right thing by trying to be a man. And the other thing we do is we need to model it. I have watched for too long within the Western church, within Western society, within Western politics. We've all had this idea, even as men, is like, oh, yes, we're so crappy and the women are so wonderful. And you see the same thing. The Mother's Day sermon is all about how women are great, and the Father's Day sermon are all about how you need to work harder. Right? Well, no, what we need is to understand that God has created men for a particular purpose. We're supposed to be strong. We're supposed to be capable. Why? So we can honor God, protect our families, and protect our civilization. If you want to, men want that. There's an interesting phenomenon that I like to talk about, and it almost seems silly to bring up in a place like this, but it's really important to understand on a cultural level. There was this series of videos that were going around on the internet for a while. And it was this symphony orchestra version. The music was a symphony orchestra version of Madonna's Like a Prayer, which seems like a ridiculous song for the video that accompanied it, but it worked. And every single video that accompanied this song was some character from a video game that predominantly is played by young men, and it was always them engaged in some sort of valiant last stand. It was them either by them. It was either the crusader that was fighting against the barbarian horde and knew he was going to die, or it's the space marines that are all gathered around a single flag and a rock, and they're being overwhelmed by enemy forces, and they're just sitting there defiantly standing to the end. And when you see this music and you see this imagery and you see that it has 10 million views and that the various offshoots of this video have millions upon millions of views themselves, why? Because every young boy wants to believe that in that sort of situation, he would be that kind of man. If we actually want to appeal to today's youth, we do have to acknowledge the struggles that they face and the uniqueness of those struggles, but then we also have to show them to be the sort of man that other people can depend on. And we need to tell them to stop asking permission from popular culture in order to do it. Just do it. Be the men that God has created you to be. And here, we're going to show you how to do it, and we're going to provide you the rites of passage. We're going to provide you the discipleship. We're going to provide you the mentorship that you need to actually become that person.
Nick, one quick sec. We're going to take a break, and folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with the author of The Man Book, Nick Freitas. We live in a culture of screens, and these screens have changed the way we behave among one another. And for example, you know, I was probably one of the last, I'm a little bit younger than you. So I was, you know, when the E.T., you know, when you ever see the E.T., the extraterrestrial, right? I like to say this, but the kids in that, they just ride around on bikes alone, and the parents sort of tangentially come into the scene once in a while, but the kids don't even realize there's parents. I literally lived that life, right? And today, a lot of kids are just on screens. Maybe part of the reason is because of these narratives. But you know, a lot of boys, they're incredibly addictive. They suck you in, and you spend your time. You see people. You know, I was writing the Tube here the other day. Everybody is doing something with their phone. It's just a lack of interaction with humans, and much more with screens. So there's that. Yeah. And the second thing that I want to mention, so that's just a structural thing. This impacts this whole question of men wanting to do those physical, active, you know, sort of protection things versus interacting with this, which obviously is a very different thing, right? In most cases. The other part is porn. I'll tell you the interaction I had. So I was at an event. Some sort of budding politician was explaining how she was going to be running for office. She passed on a website. I plugged it into, it might have even been this iPad. And before I knew it, there was some serious not safe for work things going on the iPad, right? So I quickly tried. You did. I'm in the middle of this room, right? Anyway, but what it made me think about was ubiquitous. You know, this was some sort of trap. I obviously misspelled the
.net versus .com
or something, and somehow this had been probably created to capture the attention of people who put in the wrong URL or whatever, right? And I imagine there's a lot of this, and so it got me thinking and exploring. And so basically for young people right now, there's ubiquitous, on-demand, instant access to extreme pornography that, who knows, right? There's AI now and God knows what. And I actually think it's one of these dark forces that's affecting our society, because no one wants to admit that they're involved in this, especially if they're older, right? And they have a position of, you know, importance and things like that. So never mind kids, right? So there's these other dimensions that I think are probably have a huge impact on the development of young boys. This is even on top of this, you know, kind of anti-toxic masculinity culture or whatever.
No, and Jonathan Haidt has, I think, done some of the best work on this and explaining why you should actually prevent your kids, especially
on the screen side.
On the screen side, yeah. Well, and on the interactive screen side, he actually he differentiates between watching a movie together as a family versus an interactive program on a screen, on a phone, social media, et cetera. And so I think part of the solution to that is that you don't let your kids have access to that until they reach a certain level of emotional and intellectual maturity to where they can handle what it is. And that was the practice that we use with our kids, and it seems to have worked very well. The other thing that I would say is, to your point, it is a perfect storm. So at the same time that you're telling a generation of young men, shut up, sit down, and don't do anything, there's no place for you here, there's never been an easy way to get access to things that men want, entertainment, access to women in one way or another, right? And so it's all there. And our minds are developed to actually search for efficiencies. So again, if we all want to be, let's just say we all want to have wealth and we want to have comfort and we all want to have, you know, power to some degree, but I no longer feel I can achieve it in the real world, well, there's plenty of areas online where I can feel some sense of power,
right.
Some sense of community, some sense of sexual gratification, even if it's a perverted form of all of those things, right? It sits as a stand-in, and before, we really didn't have that, at least not on those levels. So that's why I say it's a perfect storm between those things. But the antidote for that is a couple of things. One, you need good role models. You need men that are willing to actually stand up and show a different path, and to be able to show the superiority of it. So if I'm going to tell men, you need to put down the porn, and you need to go meet a real woman, well, they're going to look at me. It's like, okay, well, does that guy watch a bunch of porn, or does that guy have the sort of relationship with his wife that I would want to emulate? I've been married since I was 19. I love being married. I have a great relationship with my wife. It'd be very hard for me to tell young men, no, follow my lead if I'd been married 27 years to 3 different women. So some of it is about taking accountability for our own actions, because the best argument you make is not just the one that you articulate through your words, it's the one that you articulate through what you actually do in your own life. If you want them to believe this stuff works, then they have to see that it works in your life. The other thing that I think is absolutely essential, one of the debates that's going on here at ARC, and I feel sorry for James Lindsay, because I like James, but I think he's going to get crushed on this one. He's got to go up against Oz Guinness in explaining on whether or not a spiritual revival is actually essential to the revival of Western civilization. I think that is a ridiculous question. I can't even believe we're asking it. Of course it is. I said yesterday on stage, I don't want to just save Western civilization. I'll tell you what I want to save: Christendom. I want to save this idea that once again we recognize that what we call Western civilization didn't just appear out of the ether. It's not a result of secular humanism. It is built upon a foundation of Christian moral teaching and Christian thought. Even for the countries that didn't explicitly state they were Christian countries, like the United States, were heavily influenced by Christianity to the degree that the most common thing quoted by the founders of our country was the Bible. Before you get to Montesquieu, before you get to Locke, before you get to Blackstone, It was the Bible. So why is that so important? Because Christianity actually provides a framework. It provides a foundation for objective truth and objective morality. Right? I've played many roles in my life, but the thing that has always defined my identity is I'm created in the image of God, and I belong to Him. I'm a part of His story. He's not a part of mine. And what that means is that when things have been going great, good. I feel blessed, and I appreciate that. And when things go poorly, I don't anticipate anything else, because Christ told me to pick up my cross and follow Him. And so when I see people who are even high functioning, maybe they're incredibly successful entrepreneurs, maybe they were other people that were in the special operations community, and then all of a sudden something happens in their business, or all of a sudden something happens in their military career and they can no longer serve. And now all of a sudden they have a complete loss of identity. I've never experienced that. I've lost jobs. I know what it is to go through difficult times. I've lost friends. But I don't know what it is to lose my identity. And I don't know what it is to lose my meaning or my purpose. And when you can actually root everything that I'm talking about in something that is transcendental, right? This is or transcendent. It's not something I just made up. It's not something that I believe that is convenient. I'm not offering someone a fad fitness program or a diet. I'm saying that I think these things are universally true. And then when I point to the people that have actually applied them and lived their lives well, lived well and died well, I can actually point young men to something to aspire to. I don't want to just give them something to avoid. I want to give them something to aspire to. And that started off for me with my own son. You know, am I the sort of man that my son can look up to? And the thing that I tell young fathers all the time is, whether you like it or not, you're your son's hero up until the point you've proven to him that you shouldn't be. And so I think it's just so essential that we ground all of this in something far more transcendent than the Declaration of Independence, than Magna Carta, right? Than the Bill of Rights. We have to seek something that is universally true and eternally true and moral, and then build from there. And if we can do that, then yes, I believe that we save Western civilization, and the people that will save it will be young men that are convinced that it's worth saving.
So what you're talking about, let's see if I've got this right, is sort of officially saying, you know, Christianity, the Christian way of doing things is the way this country is going to go forward, right?
I believe I believe Christianity is true.
Sure.
And so the second question would be, does Christianity have anything to tell us about morality, about civics, about masculinity, about femininity, about marriage?
It certainly has a lot to tell.
Absolutely, right?
Right.
So if I believe that's true, well, then obviously I want to be able to convey that, both with what I say, how I argue it. I want to make an intellectually rigorous argument for those things, but I also want to apply them into my own life. And a lot of what my book is about is, my book is not preachy. I don't sit there and tell everybody, here's the 10-step program to be a man, or here's the 10-step process to have a great marriage. A lot of it is me sharing stories, some things that I got right, some things that I got horribly wrong, but in each step I learned from something because I had a standard that I was applying it to.
Right. So the reason I'm mentioning this, as we were talking earlier, I understood you to be saying that as a country, I'm thinking the U.S. here, as a country, we should adopt those values, the kind of the Judeo-Christian values as the standard. Is that what you're saying?
I think every country should. But,
okay.
but
right.
yeah, certainly. I think
right.
what's important to understand is that what we understand as Western civilization was universally adopted by countries that had adopted those as the standards.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly true.
Yeah, even in the United States, where we didn't expressly state that we were a Christian country, it's something like the vast majority of the original 13 colonies had religious tests. Now, we can argue on whether or not that's a good idea, but we can't deny that it was a part of the actual social fabric that created the civilization that we now enjoy. And so I think it's about getting back to understanding that if you remove the foundation of anything, you essentially destroy it. And in Western civilization, we have dabbled with this idea that we could essentially make secular humanism the moral foundation of representative government and property rights and free market economics. And what I hope we have discovered is, no, we can't. It's not a firm enough foundation. And so my hope is that Western civilization will once again recognize its origins and the importance of those origins, and then the individuals will freely adopt it. Because one of the tenets of Christianity is, I cannot compel you by force to become a Christian.
Right. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Final thought as we finish?
I would just say that one of the most heartbreaking and also moving things that have happened in recent history was the murder of Charlie Kirk. And if you want an example of someone who was desperate to help people and save people, Charlie Kirk did not hate his enemies. He was not animated by hate. He was animated for love of the things that he believed were true. And then he personified it in his marriage. He personified it in his fatherhood. And that's what attracted so many people to it. And when he was murdered, there was a record number of young men and young women that were saying, I'm going to church for the first time. I'm opening my Bibles for the first time. What I would tell the men of my generation is that when you have an opportunity where young men who are now exploring this and giving you a hearing for the first time in their lives are walking into your churches, walking into your institutions, what sort of men are they going to find there? Because they better find men that are willing to be strong, that are willing to be capable, that are willing to lead. Because if they find that there, they'll stay and they'll listen to you and they'll give you an audience because you have something that they want. But if they walk into those institutions and they find weak, feckless men, they're going to turn right around and walk out, and they're going to try to find strength somewhere else. And you don't want the other options where they find that strength. So be that sort of person and understand that you have a responsibility to be that kind of man, both to God, both to your own families, but to a future generation of men that are looking for discipleship and mentorship.
Well, Nick Freitas, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining Nick Freitas and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.